Hello and welcome my channel. Today I'll be telling you about an ancient ruler in his life. Sit back, close your eyes, and let yourself be swept away by this story. Please subscribe and leave a comment by Muhammad, the middle of the 1st century. Rome no longer a republic in anything but name. A single family, descended from Julius Caesar and Augustus, had held supreme power for 3 generations.
Rulings.
An empire that stretched from Britain to the edges of Persia. The Senate still met, laws were still debated, and the old republican titles were still spoken aloud. But the true source of authority in Rome had shifted entirely to one household, and to whoever could secure the loyalty of its soldiers. This was the world into which a boy named Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus was born, the year 37. A boy who would eventually become known to history as Nero, the 5th emperor of Rome, and to this day, one of its most debated rulers. To understand Nero, it is necessary to understand the family he was born into. Family defined less by affection than by ambition, suspicion, and the constant threat of violent death. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, as historians now call it, had already been marked by poisonings, for suicides, and political murders long before Nero ever took the throne. Power in this family was rarely inherited peacefully. It was seized, defended, and often paid for in blood. Nero would grow up inside this atmosphere, shaped by a mother whose ambition for her son and by a political system that offered no clear boundary between family loyalty and raw political survival. What makes Nero's story so compelling is not simply that he became emperor, but how completely his reign has divided opinion, both in his own time and ever since. To some of his contemporaries, particularly among the ordinary people of Rome, a popular figure who funded games, built public works, and eased certain tax burdens. To the senatorial class who wrote the histories that survive today, he was remembered as vain, cruel, and dangerously unfit to rule. Almost everything we know about Nero comes from writers such as Satis, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, all of whom wrote within a political culture that every reason to portray the fallen emperor in the worst possible light. This does not mean their accounts are false, but does mean that the true Nero, the man beneath the legend, has always been difficult to see clearly. Chapter 2: A Dangerous Inheritance. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most formidable political figures of the entire Roman era. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the sister of the Emperor Caligula, and a woman understood the mechanics of imperial power as well as anyone alive. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Aenobarbus, came from an old, distinguished Roman family. though ancient sources describe him as difficult and unpredictable man. He died when Nero was only 2 years old, leaving the boy's future entirely in the hands of a mother determined to secure him a place at the very center of Roman power. Agrippina's path to that goal was neither quick nor simple. During the reign of her brother Caligula, she was implicated in a conspiracy against him and sent into exile, her property confiscated, her young son in difficult circumstances. It was only after Caligula's assassination in the year 41 and the accession of his uncle Claudius that Agrippina's fortunes began to turn. Claudius, an intelligent but often underestimated ruler, eventually married Agrippina, his own niece, in a union that required a special exemption from Roman law, since its close relatives were normally forbidden. This marriage placed Agrippina, and by extension her son, directly inside the imperial household. The pivotal moment came in the year 50, when Claudius formally adopted Nero as his son, changing the boy's name from Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus to Nero Claudius Caesarus Drusus Flaccus Germanicus. This adoption effectively placed Nero above Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, in the informal hierarchy of imperial succession. Since Nero was several years older and increasingly associated with public honors and responsibilities, Agrippina worked steadily to build support for her son among the Senate, the military, and the public, arranging his marriage to Claudius's daughter Octavia, and ensuring he received a rigorous education under respected, including the philosopher and playwright Seneca, who would go on to play one of the most significant roles in early reign. Chapter 3: The Death and the Rise of a Teenage Emperor. In October of the year 54, Claudius died suddenly after a meal, and ancient sources, though not entirely, widely suspected poisoning, with many pointing directly at Agrippina as the one responsible. Whatever the true cause, the timing served Nero's interests precisely, and Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was still too young to present an immediate threat. Nero, now 16 years old, was already positioned with the political and military backing needed to claim the throne without significant resistance. On the very day of Claudius's death, the Praetorian Guard, the elite responsible for protecting the emperor, proclaimed Nero as the new ruler of Rome, and the Senate confirmed the succession shortly afterward. The beginning of Nero's reign was met with genuine optimism in many quarters of Roman society. The young emperor promised to govern with justice, to respect the authority of the Senate, and to avoid the excesses associated with some of his predecessors. Much of this early promise can be credited to the two men who guided Pali during Nero's first years in power, the philosopher Seneca, who had once been his tutor, and Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they formed a stabilizing influence around the inexperienced young emperor, managing practical business of government while Nero, still a teenager, adjusted to the immense responsibility that had been placed upon him. This period, often referred to by later Roman writers as the Quinquennium Neronis, or Nero's 5 good years, is remembered as time of relatively sound and moderate governance. Tax reforms were introduced, corruption among certain officials was addressed, and the Senate was treated with a level of respect that had not always been extended by previous emperors. It is worth pausing on this period specifically because it complicates the popular image of Nero as a ruler who was disastrous. From the very beginning, for a time at least, Rome had good reason to believe it had gained a promising young leader, guided by wise counselors, if inexperienced, good intentions. Chapter 4: Cracks beneath the surface. Behind the stability of Nero's early reign, deep tensions were already forming within the imperial family itself. Agrippina, who had worked so tirelessly to place her son on the throne, expected to remain a powerful influence over Huns once he was there. And for a time she did, appearing on coins alongside her son and involving herself directly in matters of state. Nero, however, increasingly resented his mother's continued control, a resentment sharpened by advisors like Seneca and Burrus, who saw Agrippina's influence as a threat to their own position and to the emperor's independence. This growing rift between mother and son would shape much of what followed in Nero's reign. The first major crisis came in the year 5, when Britannicus, Claudius' biological son and Nero's stepbrother, died suddenly at a banquet. Ancient sources report that he collapsed after drinking, and Ctesias explicitly claims Nero him poisoned. Fearing that now approaching the age at which he could legally claim the throne himself, represented a lingering threat to Nero's own legitimacy. Whether or not the poisoning happened exactly as described, the death of Britannicus removed the last plausible rival claimant to the throne, and it marked what many historians consider the first clear act of lethal political violence directly attributed to Nero's own initiative, rather than his mother's scheming. As Nero grew more confident and more resistant to his mother's influence, the relationship between them deteriorated further, complicated by Nero's romantic involvement with a woman named Poppaea Sabina, who, according to ancient sources, actively encouraged Nero to see his mother as an obstacle to his personal and political freedom. The situation escalated toward a devastating conclusion in the year 9, when Nero, according to the detailed and dramatic account left by Tacitus, arranged for his mother's death, first through an elaborate, failed attempt involving a self-sinking boat, and then, when Agrippina survived by swimming to shore, through a more direct assassination, but by soldiers sent to her villa. The murder of his own mother stands as one of the most infamous acts of Nero's entire life, and it permanently altered how both his contemporaries and later historians would judge his character. Chapter 5. The Emperor as Performer. One of the most distinct and, to many Romans of the senatorial class, most troubling aspects of Nero's rule was his deep personal passion for the arts, particularly music, poetry, and theatrical performance. Nero saw himself not merely as a ruler, but as an artist, and he devoted enormous energy to singing, playing the shara, a stringed instrument similar lyre, and composing verse. For a Roman emperor to publicly perform on stage once considered deeply improper by traditional aristocratic standards, since public performance was associated with professional entertainers, a socialist, considered far beneath the dignity of the imperial family. Nero, however, showed little concern for these traditional boundaries. He performed publicly in Rome and eventually traveled to Greece. Pest and athletic contests modeled on the ancient Greek games, including events at Olympia itself, where he reportedly insisted on competing in a chariot race, despite having no realistic chance of winning under normal circumstances, and was nonetheless declared the victor. To Nero, these pursuits presented a genuine passion and a vision of himself as a cultured patron Greek artistic tradition, a vision that decanted him to a broader Roman fascination with Hellenistic culture. To much of the traditional Roman lament, however, this behavior was seen as a scandalous abandonment of imperial dignity, unbecoming of a man who was supposed to embody the discipline and authority of Roman leadership. This tension between Nero's personal artistic identity and the expectation upon him as emperor runs through nearly every account of his reign. He established new games in Rome modeled on the Greek tradition, called the Neronia, and he surrounded himself with performers, authors, and artists, rather than exclusively with the traditional military and senatorial figures who had dominated earlier imperial courts. For ordinary Romans, these along with lavish public entertainment and occasional direct financial gifts, contributed to Nero's genuine popularity among the general population, even as his standing among the aristocracy and the military steadily eroded. Chapter 6. Fire and the Reshaping of Rome. In July of the year 64, a fire broke out near the Spes and spread with devastating speed through the densely packed wooden buildings of Rome, burning for 6 days, and, after a brief pause, reigniting for several more. By the time it was finally contained, large sections of the city lay in ruins, and thousands of Romans had lost their homes. This event, known to history as the Great Fire of Rome, became permanently and unfairly associated with the image of Nero, a fiddling, while his city burned, a story that is almost certainly false. Since the violin as an instrument did not exist for another 15 centuries, and even this specific claim about the cithara is not well supported by the earliest and most reliable sources. Tacitus, writing decades later that Nero was actually at his villa in Antium when the fire began and returned to Rome to organize relief efforts, opening public buildings to house the homeless, and arranging for grain to be distributed at reduced cost. Despite these relief efforts, suspicion quickly spread that Nero himself may have ordered the fire, driven by a desire to clear space for an ambitious plex he intended to build. Modern historians remain divided on this question, and the surviving evidence does thus not allow for a definitive conclusion either way. Many scholars consider the accusation unlikely to be literally true, viewing it instead as a product of intense unpopularity Nero had already accumulated among the Roman elite by this point. What is well documented is that in the aftermath of the fire, Nero moved to blame a group that Tacitus identifies as Hatins, a relatively and still violent, poorly understood religious community in Rome, subjecting members of this group to brutal public executions as a way of redirecting public anger away from himself. An episode considered by historians to be among the earliest instances of state-directed persecution against Christians in the Roman world. In the space left by the fire's destruction, Nero began construction of an extraordinary known as the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, an enormous palace complex covering a significant portion of central Rome, featuring elaborate frescoes, a large artificial lake, and according to ancient descriptions, a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself standing at the entrance. To Nero's critics, this project confirmed suspicions that he had exploited the tragedy of the fire for his own personal glorification, seizing valuable land at the very heart of the city for a private pleasure palace. After Nero's death, much of the Domus Aurea would later be built in and built over by his successors. A symbolic as well as literal effort to erase the memory of his excess from the landscape of the city. Chapter 7: Conspiracy and the Purge of Rome's Elite. By the mid-60s, opposition to Nero's rule had grown significantly among the senatorial and equestrian classes, fueled by years of political murders, heavy taxation to fund his building projects, and public spectacles, and a growing sense that Nero had abandoned any real respect for traditional Roman governance. This discontent came to a head in the year 65, in what became known as the Pisonian Conspiracy, a wide-ranging plot involving senators, military officers, and members of the Praetorian Guard, organized around a nobleman named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, who was intended to replace Nero as emperor once succeeded. The conspiracy was discovered before it could be carried out, and Nero, with a wave of ants swept. It swept through Pilicule on Cucul. Intellectual elite. Piso himself was forced to take his own life, along with dozens of others implicated in the plot. Whether through genuine involvement or simple suspicion, among the most significant casualties of the Thus Pers Sana Natsila, Nero's former tutor and one of architects of the more stable early years of his reign, who was ordered to end his own life despite ambiguous evidence, connect him directly to the conspiracy. The poet Lucan, Seneca's own nephew, was executed as well, marking the loss of one of Rome's most talented literary figures at a strikingly young age. The purge following the Pisonian conspiracy marked a decisive turning point in Nero's reign, permanently damaging his relationship with the very class of society, whose cooperation was essential to stable governance. Trust between the emperor and the Senate, already fragile after years and years of political violence within his own family, effectively collapsed. From this point forward, Nero increasingly relied on a narrower circle of loyalists and grew more isolated from additional structures of Romanical life. Setting the stage for the crisis would ultimately bring his reign to an end. Chapter 8. Revolt and collapse. By the year 68, the accumulated resentment against Nero's rule had spread beyond the city of Rome itself and into the provinces, where military commanders held real power over their own legions and had grown increasingly frustrated with the emperor's neglect of frontier affairs and his continued extravagance at the empire's expense. The first open revolt came from Gaius Julius, governor of a province in Gaul, who rose up against Nero's rule, though his rebellion was initially defeated in battle by forces loyal to the emperor. The more serious threat emerged from Spain, where the provincial governor, Galba, an elderly and respected senator with a long record of military service, declared his own opposition to Nero and gained a gathering support among other provincial commanders and, crucially, among the Praetorian Guard itself. As support for Galba spread and Nero's own authority collapsed with Rome, the Senate formally declared him a public enemy, stripping him of his authority. Abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had once secured his throne, and with few remaining allies willing to protect him, Nero fled the city under cover of darkness, taking refuge at the villa of one of his few remaining loyal freedmen on the outskirts of Rome, learning that soldiers had been sent to capture him. And he faced the prospect of a public execution, likely by being flogged to death in the traditional Roman punishment for enemies of the state. Nero chose instead to take his own life. According to Suetonius's account, Nero's final moments were marked by fear, indecision, and, according to the same hostile tradition of sources, a final theatrical lament about the loss of such a great artist to the world. With the assistance of his secretary, Nero drove Evagera into his own throat on the 8th of June in the year 68, bringing an end not only to his own life, but to the entire Julia-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since the days of Augustus, more than 90 years. More than 90 years earlier, his death plunged Rome into a brief, violent period of civil war, remembered by history as the year of the four emperors, as multiple rival claimants fought for the throne he had left behind. Chapter: The Making of a Legend. In the years and centuries following Nero's death, his reputation was shaped almost entirely by writers at every political and personal reason to portray him in the darkest possible terms. The historians whose works survive, Tacitus, Suetonius, and later Cassius Dio, were writing for audiences of by very senatorial class Nero had alienated and purged, and their accounts, while containing genuine historical detail, are colored throughout by hostility toward border ruler remembered as a tyrant who had murdered his own mother, persecuted innocent religious minorities, and squandered the resources of the empire on personal vanity. Modern historians approach these sources with appropriate caution, recognizing that some events, such as the murder Agrippina and the purges following the Pisonian conspiracy, rest on solid, evident, and injury ground, while others, including certain claims about Nero's personal cruelty or eccentricity, may be exaggerated or distorted by the biases of the writers who recorded them. At the same time, it may be inaccurate to suggest ours is purely the product of biased reporting. The documented pattern of political murder within his own family, the brutal treatment of the early Christian community following the fire of Rome, and the financially reckless extravagance of Auricula's projects like the Domus Aurea all rest on unreasonably solid historical foundations, even accounting for the hostile perspective of the sources describing them. What emerges from a careful reading of the evidence is a genuinely complicated figure, a ruler capable of real governmental competence during his early years, genuinely popular among ordinary Romans for his public spectacles and occasional generosity, and yet also responsible for real and serious abuses of imperial power as his reign progressed. Interestingly, Nero's popularity among the common people of Rome persisted even after his death, to the point that several impostors emerged in the years following his suicide, each claiming to be Nero, returned from hiding, and each finding at least some popular support before being exposed and defeated. This phenomenon, unusual for an emperor, remembered so harshly by the historical record, suggests that the relationship between Nero and ordinary Roman citizens was considerably more positive than his relationship with the aristocratic elite, who ultimately controlled how his story would be told to future generations. Chapter 10. A complicated verdict. Nearly 2,000 years after his death, Nero remains one of the most recognizable and most debated figures from ancient Rome, a name that has become a kind of shorthand for imperial excess and tyranny, even among people with little detailed knowledge of his actual reign. Yet the historical reality, as this account has tried to show, resists easy simplification. Nero came to power as a teenager by capable advisors during a period of genuinely sound governance. For gradually asserting an independence led him toward inward increasingly destructive decisions, including the murder of close family members and neighbors and the brutal suppression of political opposition. His deep personal investment in art and performance, often mocked by ancient and modern commentators alike, reflected a genuine and unusual vision of what an emperor could be, one focused on occult patronage and Greek artistic tradition rather than exclusively on military conquest, senatorial politics. Even if this vision clashed so severely with the traditional expectations,
ruler.
His handling of the Great Fire of Rome, though forever colored the enduring myth of indifference, appears in the earliest sources to have included genuine relief efforts, even as the persecution of Christians that followed remains a permanent and serious stain on his historical record. In the end, Nero's story endures because it offers a simple lesson about tyranny, but because thing more difficult and more human, the story of a young man handed absolute power before he was ready for it, shaped a family defined by ambition and violence, capable genuine competence and found cruelty, and ultimately undone by the very isolation his own choices had created. Rome would go on without him, rebuilding what the fire had destroyed and eventually restoring stability under new rulers. But the name Nero, for better or worse, would remain permanently woven into the memory of the ancient world. The world, a reminder of both the possibilities, the dangers of concentrating so much power in the hands of a single, deeply flawed human being.